Nymphomaniac. Nymphomaniac is a Lars von Trier film about a woman going through life driven primarily by her sexuality. However, if you take each chapter of her life, you'll see how important her sexuality has been in shaping her identity, making her a stronger and wiser individual. On her journey, she incorporates metaphors into her experiences, which shows the audience how each exploit has affected her. And it's from these metaphors where Trier is trying to show the importance of sexuality in our society. This first chapter, The Complete Angler, begins Jo's story with her discovery of her own sexuality. From an early age, she knew about the private parts of her body and would experience sensations that were atypical for a child to have. This only grew into her teen years, where she quickly discarded her virginity. A couple years later, she made a game with her friend to find as many men to seduce in one trade ride. She would start out pretty slow with her first seduction, but would quickly learn how easy it would be to manipulate men with a simple "what" question. Looking at her development as a person, she doesn't have any of the preconceived notions about sex and therefore is free to have fun and engage with as many men as she wants. This then brings us into Chapter 2, Jerome. Playing with as many men as she did made it hard for her to entertain the idea of love, or as she likes to call it,
lust with jealousy added.
This chapter attempts to explain what love is in all of its mysterious fashion. Trier utilizes one of Jo's play partners, Jerome, as a personification of what love is. Jerome first tries to advance their relationship only to be shut down almost immediately. Then he acts like anyone who can't get what they want and becomes difficult to be around. Yet, from their many bitter interactions, she would eventually come to want to be his. Enough time would pass, and she began seeing a kind of order in his messy actions. However, Jerome would suddenly go and see the world just as Jo had come to this realization, thusly letting her continue her exploits unabated. In Chapter 3, Mrs. H., Jo finds herself overwhelmed by men, eventually having to schedule when they may come. Only really caring for the erotic side of her relationships, she would give random treatments to the men, some being overly loving, some being painfully rejectful, and some being in the middle. On one occasion, she would mistakenly lead on Mr. H., who would, as a result, leave his family for her. Unfortunately, somehow Mrs. H. would come in and have a scene in Jo's apartment, trying to guilt her and Mr. H. Mrs. H. offhandedly attacks Jo by saying things like, "Children, get ready for therapy," or "I have a hard time seeing her enjoying loneliness," or "We wouldn't want to give your father a guilty conscience." Chapter 4, Delirium, has a tragic loss of her father who dies, hoping that Jo would refrain from slandering her mother for not being at his side. Instinctively, Jo tries to cope with her loss through her creature comfort, but is still overwhelmed by grief. The only thing she may do is sit at her father's side, watching as he battles his demented hallucinations. Chapter 5, The Little Organ School, looks at many different types of men and how they have sex. One may be particularly skilled in knowing exactly what to do and when to do it. Another may completely dominate the entire experience, only doing what he desires. And other partners may have the ability to make love. Chapter 6, The Silent Duck, shows both the incompatibility of casual sex and a family life. Trier starts the chapter with Jo losing her ability to climax or even feel anything just as she became pregnant with Jerome's child. By the time the child is born, Jo and Jerome have a domestic polygamous relationship where Jo may search for others who may be able to make her climax. Sooner than later, she becomes desperate enough to try BDSM tactics to climax, which succeeds, but at a cost of neglecting her motherly duties. This forces Jerome to leave Jo and also put their child in foster care, since neither were available to be parents. In Chapter 7, The Mirror, Trier makes Jo become aware of the trauma she has put on her body, and from this, she seeks help from sex addiction meetings. She goes to the meetings, tries to accept the sober lifestyle, and then has an epiphany that she loves being a nymphomaniac. because that's who she is, and she's not going to hide that fact. In Chapter 8, The Gun, with Jo's newfound pride in her scandalous identity, she decides to pursue a scandalous profession where she collects debts from men. She does so quite easily because she knows how men tick. This rapidly becomes a profitable business, which eventually convinces Jo to find a successor. The successor is a teenage girl who has no family and is a relative outcast from her school. Her successor picks up the business pretty quickly and eventually goes on her first solo debt collection, which is coincidentally for Jerome. During the collection of his debt, the successor, much like Jo, falls for Jerome. Irritated by this fact, and by his abandonment, she plans to kill Jerome in cold blood. But when Jo pulls the trigger, nothing happens. Jerome quickly reacts and beats her down, and then proceeds to have sex with her successor in a similar fashion to her first time. Lars von Trier tells a story that is unconventional and controversial through Jo's eyes, where she experiences a myriad of things like discovery, exploration, love, hate, dysfunction, tragedy, and heartbreak. This story ultimately shows the significance of sex and personal relationships in shaping one's identity.